Thank you so much for your feedback and requests for longer stories. We've listened to you and decided to focus on producing longer, more in-depth horror content that meets your expectations. I want to be honest with you, though. Creating high-quality, long-form stories requires significant time and effort, from research and writing to narration, editing, and production. To keep producing this content consistently without compromising quality, we need your support. Here's how you can help. Subscribe to the channel and enable notifications. Like, comment, and share the videos. Your support directly enables us to keep creating the content you love. Thank you for being part of this journey. I was not supposed to be part of that hunting trip. That is what haunts me most, even now. I had declined 3 times. 3 separate occasions throughout the spring and early summer of 2019, when James Smith approached me with promises of the perfect wilderness experience. The mountains near Bethel, he said. Fresh air, genuine solitude, a chance to disconnect from the noise of civilization and remember what it meant to hunt like our ancestors once did. I refused each time. I had my reasons back then. Work obligations, family commitments, the usual excuses that keep a person anchored to the comfortable prison of modern life. But James had a way of wearing down objections. By the time August rolled around, something shifted in me. Maybe it was fatigue. Maybe it was the slow whisper of regret that accompanies all the opportunities we let slip away. Whatever it was, I found myself saying yes. The 8 of us gathered at the meeting point near Bethel on a Friday morning. The air was already changing by late summer, carrying that crisp edge that reminds you autumn is coming. I remember thinking how the mountains seemed different that time of year. Hungrier somehow, like they were waiting for something. James Smith was our leader, though he would never have admitted that. 34 years old, weathered from decades of outdoor expeditions despite his relatively young age. He had that particular intensity about him that outdoor enthusiasts develop when they have spent more time in wild places than in civilized ones. His eyes held a constant calculation, always assessing terrain, reading the land like others read books. Emily Johnson was his wife. 38, competent in ways that suggested she had done this many times before. She checked equipment with methodical precision, ensuring nothing was overlooked. There was something watchful about her, something that noticed things the rest of us seemed blind to. Michael Williams and Jessica Garcia arrived together, though they were not a couple. Michael was 45, a construction manager who liked to present himself as a simple man with simple tastes. Jessica was his opposite in temperament, 41 and prone to elaborate stories about her previous expeditions. She volunteered information constantly, which I would later understand was a nervous habit. Robert Wilson and Amanda Clark were the couple among us. Robert was 47, quiet to the point of silence most days. Amanda, 36, seemed to do enough talking for both of them. She laughed easily and often, her voice cutting through the forest air like something that did not belong there. William Rodriguez was the oldest of our group at 63. He had brought supplies and expertise in equal measure, though he rarely offered advice unless directly asked. There was something grandfatherly about him, but also something ancient, like he carried knowledge in his bones that the rest of us could not access. Ashley Martinez was the final member, 47, a wildlife photographer by profession. She carried expensive camera equipment alongside her hunting gear, determined to document the trip for reasons she never fully explained. I wonder now if there was something she sensed from the beginning, some intuition that told her this journey needed to be recorded. The vehicles were parked in a clearing just off the main road. From there we would hike deeper into the mountains, where civilization existed only as memory. The trek would take us to a camp situated near the northern ridge, a location James claimed had been used for hunting expeditions for generations. As we began our hike that first morning, the forest around us seemed unusually quiet. There were no birds singing. I noticed this within the first mile, but I said nothing. The others were too eager, too excited with the promise of the coming days. I did not want to be the person who introduced caution into their enthusiasm. That is my first regret, not speaking what I sensed. The path we followed was narrow, maintained more by animal hooves than human feet. James led us with confident strides. Emily stayed close behind him, her eyes constantly moving across the landscape. The rest of us fell into a loose line, each lost in our own thoughts as the miles accumulated and civilization fell further and further behind. It was Michael who first asked about the markings on the trees. not slash marks, not trail blazes in the conventional sense. These were different. Deliberate gouges in the bark, often at heights that would require standing on hind legs to achieve. Some were old, the wood darkened and crusted with age. Others were fresh enough that sap still wept from the wounds. James said they were bear signs, black bears marking territory, he explained with the casual certainty of someone who had convinced himself of this reasoning long ago. I think he even believed it when he said it. But they were wrong about the size. Too large, spaced too far apart to match any animal I knew. The spacing suggested something tall, something with arms that reached higher than a standing man. We did not stop to examine them closely. James kept us moving. By midday, we reached the campsite, a clearing surrounded by towering pines that seemed to have been chosen specifically for their isolation. There was an old fire ring there, blackened from countless previous fires. Remnants of camps that had come before us. The water source was nearby, a small creek running clear and cold. The location should have felt like a perfect wilderness sanctuary. Instead, it felt like something watching us arrive. We established camp as the afternoon light began to angle through the trees in that slanted way that comes before sunset. Tents were erected. Equipment was organized. Food was stored in a manner designed to keep it safe from wildlife, though everyone knew the precautions were more ritual than science. As night began to fall, we built up the fire. The 8 of us sat in a rough circle around the flames, passing food and conversation in equal measure. But the darkness beyond the firelight seemed very close, very present. I found myself staring into it periodically, as if I might see something there if I looked long enough. That was when Ashley mentioned the indigenous stories about the area. She had researched Bethel, she explained. The region had a complicated history. Long before logging and development and the modern world, this land belonged to the Tlingit people. She spoke carefully, respectfully, as someone should when discussing cultures not their own. There were stories, she said, old stories that had survived the generations despite everything that had tried to erase them. Stories about something that walked on 2 legs but was not human. Something that could take the skin of an animal and wear it like a coat. Something that hunted in these mountains long before we ever arrived. Jessica laughed at that. Nervous laughter, the kind that tries to deflect discomfort with humor. But no one else joined her. The fire crackled. The darkness seemed to lean closer, pressing against the small circle of light we had created. James said that stories were just stories, a way for ancient people to explain predators they did not fully understand. Exaggeration and fear transformed into legend. He said it firmly, as if the certainty in his voice could push back against the darkness that had begun to feel so present around us. I did not contradict him, but I think we all felt it in that moment. The sense that we had come to a place where the modern world's certainties had very little meaning, a place where other rules applied, older rules, rules that had nothing to do with logic or reason or scientific understanding. We went to our tents early that night. Sleep came fitfully, at least for me. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the sounds of the forest, distant animal calls, wind moving through the pines, the occasional creak of tents as other people shifted in their sleep, and underneath it all, another sound. Something that might have been my imagination but felt very real, a kind of rhythmic padding, like footsteps moving through the darkness beyond our camp. Morning came gray and cold. The sun struggled to penetrate the dense canopy of trees above us. I woke to find frost on my tent, that early autumn reminder that summer was already beginning to die. The temperature had dropped more than any of us expected. I was the first one awake. Habit, I suppose. I emerged from my tent to find the camp still and quiet. The fire from the previous night long since gone cold. The world felt smaller in daylight, less threatening but somehow more vulnerable. The isolation was clearer when you could actually see how far away everything else was. I began preparing coffee. The small camp stove hissed as I heated water. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in that quiet place. I was so focused on the task that I almost did not notice the blood. It was on a rock near the creek, a dark smear that had dried during the night. I knew immediately it was fresh. Blood begins to darken after a few hours, becomes more rust than crimson. This was still red enough to indicate it had been spilled recently. Within the last few hours, certainly. I did not approach it immediately. Instead, I simply stood there, the coffee preparation forgotten, and stared at that small evidence of violence. My mind attempted various explanations. An animal had caught something else. A predator had made a kill just at the edge of our camp. Nothing unusual about that, really. It was the natural order of things in wild places. But the location bothered me. The rock was no more than 50 feet from where we had slept, close enough that whatever had shed that blood had been very near to us in the night. Maybe while we were lying in our tents. Maybe while we listened to those sounds we had attributed to wind and forest animals. I was still standing there when William Rodriguez emerged from his tent. He walked toward me slowly, his old joints moving stiffly in the cold morning air. I remember wondering how old he really was. 63 according to the information James had provided, but something about him suggested greater age, an accumulation of experiences that had settled into his bones like sediment. He saw the blood immediately. I watched his face, trying to gauge his reaction, but his expression did not change. He simply looked at the evidence and nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. Then he looked at me. His eyes were dark, the kind of dark that made you feel like he was seeing something beyond what was immediately visible. He put one hand on my shoulder, and I felt it trembling slightly. He did not say anything about the blood. Instead, he asked me if I had slept well. The question seemed absurd given what we were both looking at, but I understood what he was asking. He was asking if I had noticed things in the night, if I had heard things that had unsettled me. I told him that I had slept poorly, that I had heard sounds. He nodded again, that same slow acknowledgement of things already known. By the time the others emerged from their tents, we had made a decision. We would not mention the blood. There was no reason to alarm them, we reasoned. It was likely nothing significant. An animal death at the edge of camp, perfectly normal for wild places. The decision was made without any of this being said aloud, through nothing more than the understanding that passes between two people who recognize the same unsettling truth. Breakfast was eaten with less conversation than the previous evening. Everyone seemed subdued, though none of them mentioned the blood. Perhaps they sensed something anyway. Perhaps the forest itself was communicating a warning we were not equipped to fully understand. After breakfast, James outlined the day's plan. We would hunt, he explained. Small groups, spread across the surrounding slopes. Nothing too ambitious for the first full day. We would track game, practice our skills, and reconvene at camp before dark, simple and straightforward, the way hunting expeditions were supposed to work. I was grouped with Robert Wilson, Michael Williams, and Ashley Martinez. James considered us the least experienced hunters and assigned us a relatively easy territory to the east of camp, a gentle slope where deer were more likely to be found. Emily, James, and Jessica would head north. William and Amanda would take the western approach. We departed around 9 in the morning, moving slowly through the forest. The ground was wet from the previous night, and every step released the smell of damp earth and decaying pine needles. Ashley took photographs constantly, documenting the landscape with the focused intensity of someone capturing art. Robert said almost nothing, moving through the forest with a practiced silence that suggested he had done this many times before. Michael kept up a steady stream of nervous conversation, pointing out features of the landscape and offering information about animal behavior. The morning passed without incident. We saw tracks, deer trails, clearly marked and easy to follow. A few scat piles, still relatively fresh, indicating the animals had passed through recently. Once we heard something moving through the brush ahead of us, and Michael became excited, believing we were close to actual prey. But whatever it was moved away quickly, disappearing into denser forest before we could even see its outline. By noon, we decided to stop and eat the lunch we had brought with us. We found a small clearing near a rocky outcropping and settled down, removing our packs and allowing ourselves to rest. The physical exertion had warmed us despite the cool temperature. For a brief moment, the anxiety I had carried since discovering the blood seemed to lighten. It was Robert who noticed the trees first. They were marked similarly to the trees along the path we had hiked the previous day. Gouges in the bark, deep and deliberate. But these were different in a way I could not immediately articulate. Fresher, perhaps, or cut with greater violence. The exposed wood was white where the bark had been torn away, contrasting sharply with the darker tree trunks, and they were arranged in a pattern, circular, each tree marked at roughly equal intervals around the clearing where we sat. As if something had walked around the perimeter of this place, marking each tree as it went. Ashley began taking photographs. Her camera clicked repeatedly, capturing the marks from various angles. Michael asked if they were bear signs again, but even he did not sound convinced. The pattern was too deliberate, too much like territory marking, too much like a warning. Robert said something that stays with me. He said the marks looked fresh enough to have been made very recently, as in the previous night, or possibly even that morning. As in something had walked through these woods while we were moving through them, staying close but parallel to our position, making sure we knew it was there. The rest of our hunting expedition felt different after that. We continued on, following our assigned territory, but the easy camaraderie had evaporated. Michael's nervous chatter became even more pronounced, like he was talking to convince himself that everything was normal. Ashley kept looking over her shoulder, her camera ready as if she expected to see something emerge from the trees at any moment. Robert remained silent, but his silence had taken on a different quality. It had become a listening silence, an alert silence. We found no game. By 3 o'clock, James had arranged for us to return to base camp, and we were grateful for it. The hike back felt both shorter and longer than the hike out. Shorter because we moved with more purpose, wanting to reach the safety of the established camp. Longer because my mind was moving through possibilities I did not want to consider. The other groups had already arrived when we returned. Emily was present, but James and Jessica had not yet come back. Emily said they would be along shortly, that they had decided to move deeper into their hunting territory than originally planned, but her voice held a tightness that suggested she was not entirely comfortable with the change in schedule. We waited. An hour passed. The afternoon light had begun its descent toward evening when James and Jessica finally emerged from the forest. They both looked shaken in a way that went beyond the normal exhaustion of a day spent hunting. James had a cut on his face, a deep scratch running from his temple down toward his jaw. It had bled considerably, and he had done nothing to clean it. Jessica's hands were trembling. She sat down immediately after arriving at camp, her face pale in the fading light. James said they had disturbed something. A large animal, he explained. He was vague about the details. They had been moving through dense brush when they heard something ahead of them. They had approached, thinking it was game. What they found instead was unclear, but whatever it was, had startled them. Jessica had fallen. James had scraped his face on branches while helping her up. They had decided it was best to return to camp rather than pursue whatever it was. His explanation was reasonable enough, believable even, but his eyes told a different story. They held a fear that did not match the casual way he was recounting the events, a fear that suggested he had seen something that did not fit within the framework of rational explanations. That night, we built the fire larger than we had the previous evening. No one had explicitly suggested we do so, but the decision arose from communal agreement. The larger fire made us feel safer, or at least, it created the illusion of safety more effectively than a smaller fire would have. Dinner was quiet. After we ate, William suggested we might want to post a watch during the night, someone awake at all times, monitoring the perimeter of our camp. James resisted the idea initially, saying it was unnecessary and would only breed paranoia. But the rest of us were silent, and that silence worked as a form of pressure. Eventually, James relented. We divided the night into shifts, 3 hours each, 2 people awake at a time. I was scheduled for the middle shift, from midnight to 3 in the morning. I spent my free hours before my shift lying in my tent, unable to sleep, listening to the sounds of the forest and trying not to think about what might be making them. When midnight came, I emerged to find Ashley already awake. She was sitting by the fire, adding logs to maintain the flames. She had volunteered for the first shift without being asked. She said she did not trust that she would be able to sleep anyway, that her mind would not quiet enough to allow it. We sat together, watching the dark beyond our firelight. At one point, I asked her why she had researched the Tlingit stories about this place, why she had brought that knowledge to our group dinner on the first night. She thought about it for a long time before answering. She said that she always researched the places she visited. It was part of her process as a photographer. She wanted to understand the history and the culture. She wanted to connect with what she was documenting. But there was something else too, she admitted, something she had felt when she first learned about Bethel. A sense that the stories people told about a place usually contained truth underneath the embellishment. That legends persisted because they were rooted in real experiences that had been transformed into narrative over generations. She had expected the stories to be interesting from an anthropological perspective. She had not expected to actually believe them until she arrived in this place and felt how the land itself seemed to carry the weight of those old stories. I did not share with her what William and I had discovered that morning, or what we had seen in the marked trees, but I think she understood anyway. I think we all understood by that point. We had walked into something we did not comprehend, and understanding had become far less important than survival. Nothing happened during my watch. The night was utterly still, that particular kind of still that comes when predators are active and prey animals have gone to ground. No movement in the darkness beyond the firelight. No sounds except the crackling of the fire and the occasional wind moving through the pines. Yet I was more frightened during those 3 hours than I had been at any previous point in my life. I was afraid to look away from the darkness. The moment I turned my attention elsewhere, I felt certain something would move at the edge of my vision, something watching from between the trees, something assessing us with an intelligence that no ordinary animal possessed. Michael relieved me at 3 a.m, emerging from his tent looking as if he had slept even less than I had. We exchanged few words. There was nothing to say. He would sit with the fire as I had done, staring into the darkness and waiting for dawn. I returned to my tent and lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the forest and counting the hours until morning. By the time the sun rose on the 3rd day, we had all begun to display the symptoms of sleep deprivation, irritability, poor judgment, a tendency to misinterpret what we perceived. All of these things should have been warning signs, though we did not recognize them as such at the time. Breakfast was tense and quiet. No one proposed going on another hunting expedition. The pretense had been abandoned sometime during the night. We were no longer here to hunt. We were here to survive until we could leave. James called a meeting. The 8 of us sat around the dead fire pit, and he tried to establish some form of rational discussion about what was happening. He suggested various explanations. A large predator in the area, a bear that had become accustomed to human presence, perhaps a mountain lion, though these were rare in this region. He spoke with the tone of someone attempting to impose reason on a situation that had begun to feel fundamentally unreasonable. But we all felt it now. The wrongness, the sense that something was actively hunting us, that the game had inverted, and we were no longer the predators. Jessica suddenly began to cry, not quiet tears, but the kind of breakdown that comes when a person has held themselves together through sheer will and can do so no longer. She spoke through her sobs, saying that she had seen something. During the incident with James yesterday, when they had supposedly disturbed an animal. It had not been an animal. She described it in fragmented phrases, the words tumbling over each other in her distress. Something that stood upright, more tall than any animal she had ever encountered. Something with a face that was not quite a face. Something that had reached toward her with arms too long, joints bending in ways that no natural creature could bend. She said she had never seen eyes like that before, ancient and hungry and not human. James told her she had been frightened and confused. Her mind had misinterpreted what she had seen in the panic of the moment. But the denial in his voice rang hollow. We all knew he was lying. We all knew that he had seen the same thing she had seen. William stood up. He walked to the edge of camp, looking toward the forest. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried an authority that silenced all other conversation. He told us what we were dealing with. A skinwalker, he called it. A term from the Navajo tradition, though the concept appeared in many indigenous cultures across this continent. Something that could take the form of an animal. Something that wore skins like clothing, discarding them and assuming new ones as needed. Something that hunted humans with a patience and intelligence that human hunters could not match. He had hoped we would never encounter one. He had taken precautions when selecting this hunting ground, consulting maps and records and the advice of people who knew this region well. He had thought we were in an area where such things no longer ventured, but he had been wrong. No one questioned how William knew these things. Perhaps it was the certainty in his voice. Perhaps it was the way he spoke about creatures that should not exist with the same confidence someone might speak about weather patterns or geographical features. Perhaps it was simply that we were desperate enough to believe anything that offered an explanation for what had begun to happen to us. Michael asked what it wanted. Did it simply hunt for food? Would it be satisfied after killing one of us? William said that such creatures did not hunt for food in the conventional sense. They hunted for different reasons. Sport, perhaps, or something deeper. Something rooted in a hunger that went beyond the physical. They took what they wanted from their prey, and what they wanted was not meat. Jessica asked if there was a way to kill it. Could we fight it? Could we defend ourselves? William was silent for a long moment. Then he said that traditional defenses existed in the old stories: salt, fire, certain symbols and charms that the indigenous peoples had developed over generations of coexistence with such creatures. But these were matters of faith and belief. In the modern world, with modern weapons and modern skepticism, our options were limited. What was clear was that we could not stay here. We could not fight it effectively. Our only chance was to leave, to gather what we could, and begin the hike out immediately. James objected. He said that running would only trigger a pursuit, that predators were designed to chase prey that attempted to escape. Better to stand our ground, to build fortifications, to protect ourselves within our camp. He insisted that the rational response was to organize our defenses and wait for the creature to lose interest. But his words had lost their power. We had moved beyond the point where James was our leader. We had entered a different kind of territory, where old knowledge and old wisdom held more weight than modern certainty. I made a decision then that I have questioned many times since. I suggested that we gather what we could carry and leave immediately. We could abandon most of our equipment and supplies. What mattered was speed and distance. If we could make it back to the vehicles before nightfall, we would be safe. Emily asked a practical question. What if it followed us? What if the creature was not bound to this particular location but could follow us all the way back to our vehicles? William said that such creatures were territorial. They maintained hunting grounds, and those grounds usually encompassed a relatively limited area. If we could move far enough and fast enough, we would likely cross the boundary of its territory. Once we were beyond that boundary, we would likely be safe. Likely. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with the uncertainty it contained. But it was enough. We packed what we could in less than an hour. Backpacks with essential items, water, anything lightweight that might prove useful. We left the tents, the heavy equipment, the carefully organized camp that had taken so much effort to establish. It seemed almost absurd to abandon it so quickly. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we began our hike out. The journey back was both faster and worse than the hike in had been. Faster because we moved with a singular purpose, faster than hiking was supposed to be done. Worse because we could not shake the sense that something was moving through the forest parallel to us, matching our pace, watching us. We encountered the first evidence of this around 3 o'clock. A tree had been partially destroyed, its bark torn away in massive gouges. Fresh sap still ran from the wounds. Michael pointed it out, and we all understood what we were seeing. A territorial marking. A message. By 4 o'clock, the light was beginning to fail. The sun had moved behind the western peaks, and long shadows were spreading across the forest floor. Our pace began to slow despite our desperation to move faster. It was becoming harder to see the trail. Rocks and roots became hazards that could twist ankles or break legs. A single serious injury would slow us dramatically, and speed was our only advantage. It was at 4:30 when the first scream came. We were strung out along the trail, not quite in a single line but loosely grouped. Ashley was in the lead position, followed by James and Emily. Michael and I were in the middle. Robert, Amanda, William, and Jessica were bringing up the rear. The scream came from Robert, a sound of pure terror and agony, cut off abruptly. We stopped immediately, and several people began to turn back toward him. But William and Amanda came running toward us, their faces twisted in horror. Robert was not with them. He had lagged behind to catch his breath. Robert had stepped slightly off the trail, and the moment he did, it had moved from the forest. Amanda had seen it happen. She could not explain it, could not find words to describe the shape that had emerged from between the trees. But she had seen Robert dragged into the forest, seen his arms reaching toward her, seen his mouth open to scream. Michael wanted to go back. He was adamant. We had to go back. We could not just leave Robert. He was still alive. They might be able to help him. James said he was dead. Whatever had taken him, he was dead. Going back would only get more of us killed. Michael argued for approximately 30 seconds. Then Emily hit him across the face with enough force to stun him. When his vision cleared, Emily was pointing a pistol at the forest from which Robert had been taken. The pistol had been hidden in her pack. James had a rifle slung across his back that we had not known he was carrying. Emily said they had prepared for this, not to the extent of believing we would actually need the weapons, but as a precaution, because James had sensed something wrong about this place even before we arrived. They had come anyway, hoping to prove their instincts wrong. We resumed our movement, now even more desperate than before. The light was fading rapidly. We had perhaps an hour of functional daylight remaining. The trail seemed to be leading us toward higher elevation, which was wrong. The camp had been at a moderate elevation. To reach the vehicles, we needed to move downward. Jessica said that Michael had led us off the main trail. We were moving in the wrong direction. She was right. In our panic and darkness, we had diverged from the established path. We were moving deeper into the wilderness rather than toward safety. William said we had to stop and rest. Moving in the wrong direction through deepening darkness would only get us more lost and more exhausted. We had to make a fire and wait for morning, then reassess our position and direction in better light. There were objections, but no one had the energy to argue effectively. We found a small clearing near a rocky outcropping and began gathering wood. The gathering of wood seemed almost laughably futile. A small fire would warm us, but it would also mark our position clearly to anything hunting in the darkness. By the time we had the fire burning, full night had arrived. The forest around us was black in a way that city people rarely experience. A complete absence of light so profound it seemed almost physical. James, Emily, and William remained awake through the night, taking shifts with the weapons. The rest of us attempted to rest, though sleep was impossible. I lay near the fire, staring up at the stars that were now visible through the break in the canopy above us, and tried not to think about Robert's final scream, or about how 7 of us had become 6 with terrifying swiftness. Around 2 a.m, Michael began to act strangely. He stood up suddenly, without seeming to wake from sleep. His eyes were open but unfocused. He began walking toward the darkness beyond the firelight. William called to him, but Michael did not respond. He continued walking, moving deeper into the black forest with a purpose that suggested he was being pulled. Emily rushed after him. They struggled at the edge of the firelight. Emily was shouting, trying to pull Michael back toward the fire. For a moment, it seemed she might succeed. Then Michael turned to face her, and what was in his eyes was not Michael anymore. The thing that emerged from between the trees was faster than any of us could have anticipated. It took Michael at the moment he looked at Emily, moving with a speed that seemed to bend the space between where it had been and where it now was. There was no drawn-out struggle, no final scream like Robert had given. Michael simply ceased to exist. One moment he was there, the next moment he was gone, and the thing that had taken him was dissolving back into the forest like smoke. Emily stood frozen at the edge of the firelight, blood covering her face and clothes. James pulled her back to the fire. She was still alive, but something had broken inside her in those few seconds. She sat staring at nothing, not responding to voices or touches. That left 5 of us. James and Emily, despite her broken state. William, who seemed unsurprised by what had happened, as if it confirmed something he had long suspected. Ashley, whose camera hung at her side but was no longer being used. Jessica, who sat with her knees drawn up against her chest, rocking slightly back and forth. And me. Morning came in shades of gray, the sun rising but unable to penetrate the clouds that had gathered during the night. The temperature had dropped further, and a cold mist clung to the forest floor. We broke camp without speaking. What words could be offered? What explanations or reassurances could possibly apply to our situation? William managed to determine our correct direction as the light improved. We had indeed been traveling away from our exit point. We altered our course, moving now toward the southwest. If his estimates were correct, and if we could maintain our pace, we might reach the vehicles by late afternoon. If we could maintain our pace, we moved through the forest with a desperate kind of caution. We did not move as fast as we had the previous afternoon because we could not afford to become injured or separated. We stayed close together, even though staying close together meant there were more of us to notice when one of our group was no longer with us. It happened around 9 a.m. Jessica simply disappeared. She had been walking directly in front of me, her slight frame moving between the larger bodies of James and William. Then she was not there. I looked ahead and saw only James and William. I looked behind and saw only myself and Ashley. The moment when Jessica had been taken was so seamless that none of us were certain it had even happened. James insisted we continue. We could not stop. We could not afford to slow down or become distracted by what had already happened. Jessica was gone, and stopping to grieve or search would not change that. But we had stopped believing in coincidence by that point. The creature was hunting us. It was taking us one by one, with a leisure that suggested it was in no hurry. It was feeding on our fear as much as anything else. The forest seemed different as we walked. The trees were taller here, more ancient-looking. The spaces between them were wider, suggesting we had moved into a section of older growth that had never been logged. The light filtering through the canopy was dim and greenish, as if we were walking at the bottom of an ocean rather than through a terrestrial forest. William spoke as we walked, his voice quiet so as not to carry far into the surrounding woods. He began to tell us the history of this place, the real history, the one not found in any conventional sources. He said that long ago, before European contact, this land had been known as a place where the barriers between worlds grew thin, where things from other places could occasionally cross over into this one. The Tlingit people had learned to coexist with such creatures over centuries, developing methods and practices to protect themselves and negotiate with entities that existed outside the normal order of nature. But the presence of humans who did not understand these rules had begun to change things. The creatures that lived in the wild places had grown emboldened. Their traditional hunting grounds had been reduced by logging and development, and in their desperation, they had begun to hunt more aggressively. He knew all of this because his grandmother had been Tlingit. She had taught him these things in his childhood, though he had spent most of his adult life trying to forget them, trying to believe that the modern world had rendered such knowledge irrelevant. He had been a fool, he said, an arrogant fool who had thought that civilization had made him safe from things that existed in the margins of the civilized world. I asked him if there was any way for us to protect ourselves, any of the traditional methods that his grandmother had taught him. He said there were some things we could do, but they required materials we did not have and a level of spiritual belief that none of us possessed. We could try salt if we had it, or fire drawn in a particular pattern, or certain words spoken in a language that predated English. But without genuine faith in such protections, they would likely do no good. The only real protection was avoidance, recognizing the territories where such creatures hunted and choosing not to enter them, living in places where human civilization was strong enough that the boundaries between worlds remained firm and sealed. By midday, we had been walking for hours with no sign of the vehicles or the main road. The forest continued in all directions, apparently endless. William began to accept that his navigation had been wrong, that we were more lost than he had thought. We stopped to rest, collapsing beside the trail, our legs aching and our minds fracturing under the strain of constant vigilance. We had been awake for approximately 36 hours. Our bodies were demanding rest, even though our minds insisted that stopping was a death sentence. It was while we were resting that we found the body. It was William who spotted it first, a shape among the trees, roughly human-shaped, but wrong in ways that made the mind resist fully comprehending what it was seeing. It was Robert, or what remained of Robert. He had been positioned deliberately, propped against a tree trunk. His clothes had been removed, or at least hung around him in tatters. His skin had been flayed away in long strips, creating a macabre pattern of exposed muscle and bone. But he had not been killed by this treatment. The injuries were too clean, too precise. They had been inflicted after death, or immediately before it, with a care that suggested artistic intention. What was most horrible was that his face remained relatively intact. His eyes were open and staring toward nothing. His mouth hung slightly open. He had an expression that suggested he had died knowing exactly what was being done to him. Emily made a sound that was not quite human. It was the sound of a person whose sanity had finally completed its journey to breaking. She stood up and began walking away from us, moving in no particular direction, simply fleeing. James caught her after she had gone perhaps 20 feet. He held her, and she thrashed in his grip, fighting him with a strength born of desperation. Eventually, she collapsed again, and he simply held her while she made that same terrible sound, over and over. Ashley was taking photographs. I realized what she was doing and almost said something to stop her, but I did not. If we survived this, there needed to be evidence. There needed to be documentation of what had happened here, proof that we had not simply imagined it. William looked at Robert's body with sadness and understanding. He said that Robert had probably been taken during the night, while Emily was distracted by Michael. The creature had been feeding on them systematically, taking them when they were vulnerable. I asked how much longer this would continue, how long before it took all of us. He said it would continue until we were gone, or until we escaped. He could not say which outcome was more likely, but he suspected we had perhaps until nightfall. The creature would want to complete its feeding before darkness came, assuming we had not already died of exhaustion or exposure by then. We did not rest much longer. There was no point. The presence of Robert's body nearby had rendered rest impossible, no matter how desperately our bodies needed it. We gathered ourselves and resumed walking, moving with the slow mechanical steps of people operating at the end of their physical and mental endurance. I have little memory of the hours that followed. I know that we walked. I know that the forest remained around us, relentless and endless. I know that William continued to provide navigation guidance, though he seemed increasingly uncertain about whether we were moving in the correct direction. I remember Ashley asking James whether they had posted the watch on the first night because they had expected something to happen. She asked in the kind of hollow voice people use when they already know the answer and only want confirmation of knowledge that terrifies them. James said that he had suspected something was wrong before we even arrived. There had been reports. Disappearances among hunters and hikers in the area over the past several years. Patterns that had not been explained but could not be ignored. He and Emily had decided to attempt this expedition anyway, telling themselves that they could handle whatever they encountered. They had told themselves a lie. By 4 o'clock, the light was beginning to fail again. The second sunset. The second time we would have to spend the night in this place. But now there were only 5 of us where there had been 8. William said we needed to find high ground. If we could reach an elevated position with a clear sight line to the surrounding forest, we might be able to see the creature coming. We might be able to defend ourselves or at least have warning before the final strike came. We moved upslope, following what seemed to be a ridge line that rose through the forest. The climbing was difficult. My legs were screaming in protest. My vision had begun to blur at the edges. I was not sure how much longer I could continue moving under my own power. The ridge opened into a small plateau surrounded by ancient pine trees. The space was relatively clear of underbrush, and the rock underneath was solid and bare. It was defensible in the way that most spaces in the forest were not. James and Emily worked to clear a larger space. They dragged dead wood away, creating a circle where we could build a fire. William gathered wood while Ashley and I simply sat, too exhausted to contribute effectively to the preparations. The fire was built as the last light was fading from the sky. This time we made it larger, piling wood high, creating as much light and heat as we could. It felt like a futile gesture, like we were building a monument to our own mortality rather than constructing an effective defense. We huddled around the fire, and no one spoke. What words remained unspoken seemed to hang in the air between us, too heavy and too terrible to give voice to. Around 8 o'clock, William said it was coming. Not because any of us had seen or heard anything, but because he could feel it. He said that such creatures cast a shadow that people with sensitivity could sometimes perceive, a darkness that existed alongside the normal darkness of night. I asked him what would happen to us. He said that we could run, and the creature would hunt us down, or we could fight, and we would fail because we were not equipped to fight such things, or we could make peace with what was about to happen and simply endure it. As if in response to his words, the fire began to dim. The flames flickered and guttered, drawing down smaller and smaller despite the abundance of wood. It was not the wind doing this. The air around us was still. Something was drawing the heat away from the fire, suffocating the light with a will that was almost physical. James raised his rifle, pointing it at the darkness beyond the shrinking firelight. He did not shoot. He simply held the gun steady, waiting for a target that would not come until it was too late to aim at it. I looked toward William, wanting a final explanation or reassurance or anything that might make sense of what was about to happen. He was staring toward the darkness, and on his face was an expression that contained both sorrow and something else. Resignation, perhaps, or recognition. Like he was greeting an old acquaintance that he had hoped never to encounter again. He said one word, a word in a language I did not understand. It sounded like the name of the thing that was coming for us, spoken with a knowledge that came from a place deeper than language. The fire died completely. In the space of a single heartbeat, every flame vanished, leaving us in absolute darkness. There was no transition. There was no gradual dimming. One moment we were sitting in light, and the next moment the darkness was total and complete, as if light had never existed in this place. I am going to tell you what I experienced in that darkness, and I want you to understand that I cannot be certain any of it was real. Memory becomes unreliable under extreme stress and trauma. The mind generates explanations for things it cannot process. But whether what I experienced was physical reality or the breaking of a mind confronted with something it could not comprehend, the terror I felt was absolutely genuine. There were sounds in the darkness, movement, the sound of something large moving through the space where moments before we had been sitting around the fire. But the movements seemed to be happening all around us at once, as if the thing making them did not follow the laws of physics that governed movement through space. Someone screamed. I think it was Emily, but her scream was cut off mid-sound, as if a hand had been placed over her mouth. I tried to run. My legs moved, though I could not see where I was running to. I simply ran toward where I thought the edge of the plateau should be, hoping to find descent that might lead away from whatever was in the darkness with us. I ran directly into James. We fell together, tangling in the darkness. I heard his rifle discharge, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in that absolute black. The shot went wild, hitting nothing, wasting a bullet we could not afford to waste. Ashley was running in a different direction, her photographer's instinct driving her to flee toward what she perceived as open space. I heard her footsteps. Then I heard her cry out as she reached the edge of the plateau and discovered the drop too late to stop herself. The sound of her falling seemed to go on for an impossibly long time. William did not run. When the fire had died, he had simply stood in place, waiting. I could hear his voice in the darkness, speaking in that language I did not understand. Words that sounded like prayers or invocations or the names of things that lived in old places and old times. The voice speaking the language became younger. It transformed. Instead of William's aged tones, I was hearing a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone in their 20s or 30s. The words continued, unchanged in their sounds, but the voice that spoke them had become something else. And then I heard William scream. Not in pain exactly, but in understanding, like he had finally seen something he had been trying to avoid looking at for his entire life. The scream lasted for several seconds, then stopped abruptly. I was still entangled with James when the thing that had been hunting us finally allowed me to perceive it directly. The darkness did not fade, the light did not return, but in my mind, suddenly and with terrible clarity, I could see what was standing among us. It was not shaped like any animal I had ever encountered. Its body was too long, its joints arranged in angles that suggested bones and cartilage could bend and flex in ways human anatomy never could. What might have been a head existed at one end of its form, but it contained too many eyes in places where animal eyes should not be. But what was most horrible was that it wore skins like clothing, multiple layers, each one taken from a different creature, animal skins and something else, something that might have been human. I do not know how long I remained trapped in jam. You ever get that feeling where your instincts scream at you before your mind can catch up? That primal knowing that something is deeply wrong, even when everything looks fine on the surface. I had that feeling the moment we arrived in KOTZEBUE, but I was too excited to listen to it, too caught up in the promise of pristine hunting grounds and untouched wilderness. Now I understand that feeling was a warning, a last mercy from whatever watches over us in those remote places. My name is irrelevant to what happened. What matters is what 8 of us witnessed during that summer expedition, what we survived, or more accurately, what survived us. We came together through an online hunting community, 8 strangers bound by nothing but a shared passion for the hunt and a dangerous curiosity about the Alaskan wilderness. Richard Hernandez, 59 years old, had organized the entire trip. He ran a successful outfitting business in Anchorage and had secured permits for the remote regions surrounding KOTZEBUE. Amanda Lopez, 55, was Richard's longtime business partner. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to navigate by instinct alone, rarely needing maps or GPS devices. Christopher Anderson, 44, was a retired military man with a stocky build and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from having seen real conflict. Lauren Thomas, 61, was the oldest among us and perhaps the wisest, though none of us listened to her warnings. Daniel Taylor came next. 50 years old, he was a wilderness guide by trade and had spent decades traversing Alaska's interior. Rachel Moore, 35, was the youngest of our group besides myself. She worked in marketing but possessed an almost reckless courage that would later prove to be both a strength and a liability. Matthew Jackson, 42, was my closest friend in the group. We had met years prior through mutual contacts and had bonded over our shared philosophy that true living meant pushing boundaries. Finally, there was Nicole Martin, 58, a retired professor who specialized in folklore and indigenous cultures. She had insisted on joining us, claiming academic interest in the region. We arrived at KOTZEBUE on a Saturday in mid-June, just as the sun decided to stop setting for the season. That perpetual daylight should have been comforting. Instead, it felt suffocating. The midnight sun cast everything in shades of amber and gold, creating shadows that never fully dissolved. The small town of KOTZEBUE seemed to crouch at the edge of the Arctic Ocean like something waiting. Waiting for what? I could not yet say. Richard had rented a lodge about 40 miles from town, positioned on the tundra with views of the Brooks Range in the distance. It was beautiful in a way that made your chest tighten. Too beautiful. The kind of beauty that conceals rather than reveals. Our provisions had been shipped ahead, and we spent the first evening stocking the lodge, checking equipment, and reviewing hunting routes. Daniel pulled out topographical maps showing the areas where caribou and moose populations were strongest. The conversation was animated, filled with the easy camaraderie of people who had not yet learned to be afraid of each other. As the evening progressed and we settled around the large stone fireplace, Nicole poured herself a glass of whiskey and mentioned something that would have implications we did not understand at the time. She said, almost casually, that the indigenous peoples of the region had strict taboos about hunting certain animals, specific animals that should never be taken, specific patterns and behaviors to watch for. Richard laughed. He dismissed her concerns as superstition. He said we came here as hunters, as modern people with modern weapons, not as believers in old legends. Matthew agreed with him. I remember Christopher watching Nicole with an expression I could not read. Daniel said nothing, but his jaw tightened. Lauren asked what kinds of taboos Nicole was referring to. Nicole hesitated then, which was unusual for her. She mentioned shapeshifters. She mentioned creatures that were not quite animal and not quite human. She mentioned a word in a language I did not recognize, and when I asked her to repeat it, she shook her head and said it was better not to speak such names aloud in certain places. Rachel made a joke about it. Matthew laughed. Richard returned to discussing hunting strategies, but I noticed that Daniel collected the maps and carefully put them away, and I noticed that Lauren watched Nicole with an expression of deep concern. That night, I lay in my bunk listening to the sounds of the Arctic. The wind moved differently here. It had intentions. It circled the lodge like something alive and curious, testing the walls, probing the windows. Around 3 a.m, a sound cut through the wind. It might have been an animal. It might have been something else entirely. It was high-pitched and sustained, like a scream that had been stretched and distorted. It made my teeth ache. I went to the window and looked out at the endless tundra. In that false twilight created by the midnight sun, I could see the landscape clearly. Rolling hills covered in low vegetation, distant mountains, empty sky, and there, perhaps a mile away, a figure stood motionless. It was too far to see clearly, but I could discern humanoid shape. Too tall to be a man, too angular. It was facing the lodge, or facing our direction at least. Even at that distance, I felt the weight of its attention. I watched it for perhaps 30 seconds. Then it dropped to all fours and ran. Not like a man running, like something else entirely, like an animal that had briefly forgotten how to pretend to be human. By the time I could comprehend what I had seen, it was gone, absorbed into the shadows and the landscape. I told myself I had imagined it. Altitude, jet lag, overstimulation from the constant daylight. But I knew better. Some part of my brain that predates civilization, that part which still carries memories of when we were prey, knew exactly what I had seen. I did not sleep for the remainder of that night. The first week passed in a strange limbo of normalcy and wrongness layered together like poorly mixed paint. We established a daily rhythm. We would wake, prepare equipment, and venture out into different sections of the territory surrounding the lodge. Daniel would lead most expeditions, with Christopher always positioned as a kind of secondary guide, his military bearing and tactical awareness making him naturally suited to the role. The hunting itself was productive. We spotted caribou, moose, and various smaller game. We took some trophy animals according to our permits, the freezers at the lodge filled with meat, but other things were happening that nobody wanted to discuss directly. Small things, disturbing things. On the second night, we heard an animal moving around the lodge perimeter. It circled for hours, its footfalls audible on the gravel around the foundation. Daniel and Christopher went outside with rifles, intending to drive it away or identify it. They found nothing, no tracks, no evidence of anything except the scent, which both men described as profoundly wrong. Daniel struggled to articulate it. He said it was like animal smell mixed with human smell mixed with something that belonged to neither category. On the fourth day, we discovered that several sets of game cameras we had positioned to monitor wildlife movement had been deliberately disabled, not damaged by animals, deliberately disabled. The camera housings were open, the memory cards removed, the devices arranged in a specific pattern that suggested intention. Richard wanted to blame bears. Lauren asked why a bear would remove memory cards. Matthew went missing for 6 hours on the 5th day. He had gone out alone before dawn, wanting to position himself for first light hunting. When he did not return by midday, we organized a search. We found him walking back toward the lodge at 2 in the afternoon, and he appeared to be in a state of shock. His clothes were torn. His hands were bleeding. When we asked him what happened, he could not articulate a clear answer. He said he had gotten turned around. He said the landscape had seemed to shift. He said he had been running, though he could not remember why, and something had been behind him. Something that moved between the trees in ways that defied geometry. He would not talk about it further. He took a powerful sedative and slept for 18 hours. When he woke, he seemed like himself again, but there was something absent in his eyes, a light that had been extinguished. Rachel suggested we leave. She said it to me privately, in the kitchen while she was preparing one of her meals. She said something was wrong with this place. She said she could feel it in her bones, and she had learned long ago to trust that sensation. I agreed with her, but I also said nothing to the others. I was embarrassed by my own fear. I was embarrassed to voice concerns that sounded so irrational. On the 7th day, we found the elk. Christopher and I discovered it while checking one of the eastern boundaries we had established. It was a massive creature, possibly the largest elk either of us had ever encountered. It was dead, but not recently killed. The carcass had been deliberately positioned in the center of a clearing, arranged with its legs splayed outward in an almost geometric pattern. The animal had been systematically torn apart, but not eaten. The meat was left to rot. It was a message, a display, a warning that something could kill things larger and more powerful than itself, and kill them for no practical reason. Christopher examined the wound patterns and said something that I will never forget. He said, in his quiet military voice, that he had seen predators kill for food, and he had seen humans kill for sport and for war. He said he had never seen anything kill with the kind of precision and intent that this kill displayed. He said whatever did this was not hunting, it was practicing. We did not tell the others immediately. We collected samples, photographed everything from multiple angles, and recorded detailed notes. Christopher had developed an instinct, probably from his military background, to document evidence before reporting potential threats. I am grateful for his foresight, because what came next moved with terrible speed. That night, Lauren had a conversation with Daniel that the rest of us overheard in fragments. They thought everyone else was asleep. Lauren was saying that the warnings she had known as a child, stories passed down from her grandmother who had indigenous roots, spoke of creatures that hunted in summer. She said these creatures were territorial. She said if we had crossed into their territory and taken game, we had declared ourselves competitors. She said the thing that had been circling the lodge was testing us, assessing us. Daniel said we needed to leave immediately. Lauren agreed, but then Christopher emerged from the darkness and said they could not leave. He said something had been injured, or possibly was lying, in the territory we had covered over the past week. He said he had glimpsed it at first light, and it moved with a wrong gait. Something was damaged. Something was weakened. He said if we left now, if we showed fear and retreat, we would be hunted for the rest of our lives. It would pursue us. It would follow us home. The only way to end this, he said, was to face it and finish it. Richard emerged then and said Christopher was insane, that we were all losing our minds from stress and isolation, and that he was taking a vote on whether we departed in the morning. The discussion spiraled into something that was not quite a fight but was more than a simple disagreement. Lauren supported leaving immediately. Daniel seemed torn, caught between fear and something else, something that looked like pride or responsibility. Rachel wanted to leave. Matthew was silent, which was notable because Matthew was usually the one pushing for more adventure, more risk. Nicole said we could not leave until we understood what we were dealing with. Christopher said understanding and leaving were incompatible. Richard said the decision would be made by vote in the morning. Nobody slept well that night. The morning brought no vote. Instead, It brought a disruption that eliminated any possibility of calm deliberation. We discovered Rachel was gone. Her bunk was empty. Her equipment was in the lodge. Her bedroom window was open from the inside, which should have been impossible because Christopher had checked all windows and door locks the previous evening. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no evidence of anything except absence. The panic that seized us was genuine and primal. This was no longer philosophy or folklore or abstract fear. One of us had vanished. One of us was gone. And the circumstances suggested something we were not equipped to understand had taken her. Richard wanted to organize a search party immediately. Christopher argued that searching would be futile and dangerous. Daniel agreed with Christopher. Nicole said we needed to think strategically. Lauren began to gather certain supplies from the kitchen and her room in a manner that suggested preparation for something specific. She refused to explain what she was doing. Matthew had returned to his previous state of shock. He sat by the window, staring at nothing, and did not respond when spoken to. I stood in the middle of this chaos, feeling the weight of my own uselessness. I was a hunter. I was competent in wilderness survival, but I was not equipped for this. None of us were. Around 10 in the morning, Daniel made a decision that would alter the course of everything that followed. He said he knew the territory. He said he had a theory about where the creature was centered. He said he would track Rachel himself, and if anyone wanted to join him, they should prepare for a difficult search. Christopher immediately said he would accompany Daniel. 2 experienced men, 2 weapons, 2 people who understood tracking and survival. It seemed like a reasonable plan given the impossible circumstances. Richard insisted on joining them. He said Rachel was part of his expedition, and he would not abandon her. That was the only time I agreed with Richard. It was not a decision based on logic. It was a decision based on responsibility and loyalty. Nicole said she would remain at the lodge with Lauren and Matthew. She said she wanted to study the materials Lauren had been gathering. She said she was beginning to understand something about what we were dealing with, and she needed time and reference materials to verify her theories. Lauren agreed. She said she would protect Matthew, and she would protect Nicole, and she would prepare for the possibility that the men did not return. That left me at an intersection. I could go with the hunting party, or I could stay at the lodge. I chose to go. I cannot explain this choice rationally. On some level, I understood it was dangerous. On some level, I recognized that my presence would add no tactical advantage. But the alternative was to remain at the lodge while my friends ventured into that terrifying landscape, and I could not accept that cowardice. We departed at 11 in the morning, equipped with rifles, knives, maps, communication devices, and enough supplies to move through the terrain for 3 days if necessary. Daniel led, reading the landscape like text. Christopher watched our flanks and our rear. Richard and I followed, maintaining awareness but not leading. The Arctic tundra spread around us in every direction, beautiful and hostile, like a sentient thing that had allowed us entry but was calculating the price of our intrusion. We moved for 6 hours without finding clear evidence of Rachel. Daniel's tracking was meticulous. He pointed out disturbances in the vegetation, territories marked by scat and sprayed urine, the pathways that various animals habitually used. But no sign of Rachel herself, no trail of clothing, no blood, no indication of her passage through this landscape. As afternoon approached and the sun hung at a strange angle in the sky, Daniel stopped and raised his hand for us to halt. He pointed ahead to a ridgeline approximately a half-mile distant. He said that ridge was the boundary of the territory he suspected held the answer to our questions. He said that territory was different. He said animals avoided it. He said even the vegetation seemed wrong there, twisted and sparse as if life itself was reluctant to flourish in that place. Christopher examined the ridge through binoculars and said he could see structures, old structures, what looked like remains of habitation built into the hillside. Daniel nodded as if this confirmed something he had suspected. He said what we were about to do was enter into territory that wanted us dead. He said our only advantage was that we were 4 skilled hunters with modern weapons, and we were moving in daylight. He said as soon as darkness came, we retreated to a defensible position, or we did not retreat at all. Richard asked what he meant by that last part. Daniel did not answer immediately. Then he said, "We will either kill it, or it will kill us. There is no middle ground." We advanced toward the ridge. The landscape changed as we moved closer. The vegetation became sparser. The ground became rockier. The air temperature seemed to drop, though this was likely psychological. Birds that had been present throughout our journey disappeared. The hum of insects ceased. It was as if life itself recoiled from this place. The structures Daniel had identified became clearer as we approached. They were old, very old, built from stone and bone. There were 3 of them, arranged in a pattern that looked like it could be deliberate. They seemed to be shallow caves, augmented with constructed walls. They looked like dens, or lairs, or something worse. And that is when we found Rachel. She was positioned in front of the central structure, and at first I thought she was dead. She was naked, laid out on the stone ground with her arms at her sides and her legs together. Her skin was pale, almost luminescent in the Arctic light. But as we approached, moving cautiously now, our weapons held loosely but ready, I realized she was breathing. Her eyes were open, staring upward at the sky. She was alive, but she did not respond when we called to her. She did not turn her head. She did not acknowledge our presence. Christopher approached her carefully, and as he knelt down to examine her, his entire body went rigid. He held up a hand to stop Richard from advancing further. He looked back at us with an expression I will carry to my grave. He said, "It is not her." His words seemed to crack the world. Not her? She was Rachel. I could see her face. I could see her features. But as we came closer, against every instinct screaming at us to retreat, I began to understand what Christopher meant. The body that wore Rachel's face was arranged wrong. The proportions were subtly incorrect. The movements of her breathing were not quite synchronized with what a human body should do. Her eyes, though they looked like Rachel's eyes, were reflecting light in a way that eyes should not. And then she spoke, using Rachel's voice. But the voice came from a throat shaped wrong, and it said, "You should not have come here." That is when we heard the sound. It came from above us, from the ridge itself. It was not a roar, though it was louder than any animal sound should be. It was not a scream, though it contained agony that no voice should be capable of producing. It was a sound that carried intention and intelligence and ancient malice. It was a sound that rewrote everything we thought we understood about the world. The thing emerged from behind one of the structures. I will not attempt to describe it in perfect detail, because my mind refuses to retain precise visual memory of what I saw. This is survival. This is my consciousness protecting itself by withholding clarity. But I will tell you what my senses registered. It was large, taller than a man, though it moved on 4 limbs when it did not stand upright. It had elements that were wolf and elements that were human and elements that belonged to nothing in the taxonomy we had been taught. Its fur was dark, matted in places with fluids that might have been blood. Its face was a fusion. Its teeth were wrong. Its eyes were the worst part because they were intelligent. They held comprehension and cruelty and the satisfaction of a hunter that had herded its prey to exactly where it wanted them. Christopher fired. The shot was clean, professional, aimed at what would be the vital organs if this thing followed normal biological architecture. The creature shrieked, and the sound was so disorienting that Richard dropped his weapon. The projectile had struck it, had passed through something, had caused injury, but the injury did not slow it. Instead, it seemed to trigger something. The creature moved toward us with speed that made reality feel wrong. Things should not move that fast. Bodies should not transition between forms that fluidly. Daniel fired next, and Christopher fired again, and the creature was hit multiple times, but it did not fall. It reached Richard and struck him with a force that took his body and threw it 20 feet backward like he weighed nothing. Richard struck a rock formation and did not move again. Christopher moved toward the creature with the kind of tactical training that had served him in actual combat. But this was not combat. This was something else. The creature shifted as Christopher approached, and where it had been wolf-like, it became something more human, and it used limbs to defend that should not have been capable of articulation. Christopher fought it. He was brave and trained and desperate, but he was still just a man against something that defied every rule of biology he understood. Daniel grabbed my arm and ran. He pulled me away from the structures, away from the slaughter happening behind us, down the ridge and into the tundra. I did not want to abandon Christopher. My legs were moving, but my mind was still there, still seeing things I cannot unsee. Daniel was shouting at me to keep running, to not look back, to move faster, and I obeyed because my survival instinct was stronger than my loyalty. We ran for hours. I have no clear memory of the passage of time. We ran through terrain that became increasingly chaotic as daylight stretched and distorted into something that was neither day nor night. We ran toward the lodge because the lodge was shelter and the lodge was sanctuary, and we had to warn the others. And somewhere behind us, moving faster than anything should move, the sound of pursuit. We reached the lodge as the false twilight settled into something approaching actual darkness, though in June, in that latitude, darkness was more of a concept than a reality. Daniel burst through the door and immediately went to the gun cabinet, loading rifles with methodical precision. Nicole and Lauren emerged from the main room, their faces showing that they already knew something was wrong. Matthew was still positioned by the window, unchanged from where I had last seen him. I tried to articulate what had happened, but my words came out in fragments. Killed. Rachel. Not Rachel. Richard. Christian. Running. Behind us. Lauren listened, and her face shifted into an expression of grim certainty. She went to a large wooden chest in the corner of the lodge and withdrew a bundle wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing objects that looked ceremonial. Bundles of dried herbs, small carved figures made from bone, talismans that seemed to be very old. Nicole's academic demeanor cracked, and she moved to help Lauren with what looked like ritual preparation. Daniel asked what they were doing. Lauren said they were doing what should have been done at the beginning, before arrogance and pride had gotten in the way. She said she was going to perform a protection against the thing that hunted us. She said it would not keep it out forever, but it might slow it. It might create an interval in which we could think. Daniel asked if she was serious. She said, "I have the blood of my grandmother running through my veins, and she knew these things more truly than any of us can know them. We will protect this space or we will die in it, but we will not do it by conventional means." Nicole began moving through the lodge, placing the bone carvings at specific points. She was following Lauren's direction, but with an academician's precision, documenting what she was doing. She said later that she wanted someone to understand what they were attempting, wanted some record of it beyond their own testimony. Matthew moved for the first time since we had left. He stood up and walked to the window, and he said, "It is at the perimeter. It has found us. It is testing the boundary." We looked out at the tundra surrounding the lodge. In that strange light, I could see movement, a large shadow. It was moving in a circle around our refuge, investigating every surface, every potential entry point. Occasionally, it would pause and raise what might have been its head and release that terrible sound. Not a howl, not a scream, something worse. Daniel said we had perhaps 3 hours before it attempted entry. He said we needed to secure the lodge completely. He said we needed to prepare, even though none of us truly understood what preparation meant. The next hours were surreal. We reinforced the door. We covered the windows. We positioned weapons at strategic points. Daniel and Nicole worked together to establish what they called a defensive perimeter, which involved more of Lauren's ritual objects placed at key locations. Matthew did not help. He remained by the window, watching the thing outside, and his behavior suggested he was observing something that the rest of us could not fully perceive. Around 4 a.m, when the sun was at its lowest point in the sky, creating something approximating actual darkness, the attacks began. It started with violence against the door. The creature threw itself against the physical barrier, testing it, learning it. The door held, but each impact created a sound that was more than just physical collision. There was something wrong with the physics of it, something that suggested the creature was striking from multiple angles simultaneously or striking with forces that should not have been possible. Then it tried the windows. We had covered them with heavy material, but we could still hear the assault, scraping sounds, impact sounds. And beneath those sounds, the voice of the thing speaking in Rachel's voice, speaking in Richard's voice, speaking in voices that might have been its own natural voice if it had a nature that included speech. It said things. I remember fragments. It said we had no right to this territory. It said we had taken from it. It said there was a payment that needed to be extracted. It said Rachel had been willing but the others had not, and the unwilling ones were more satisfying to consume. It said the meat of men was different from the meat of animals, more complex, more flavorful, more enlightening. Lauren continued her work, chanting words in a language that was not English. Nicole supported her, speaking in what might have been academic interpretation or might have been her own understanding of the ancient words. Daniel remained at his defensive position, but I could see his hands shaking. I realized that Daniel knew something. He had encountered this thing before, or something like it, and he had survived it then, but survival had left marks that went deeper than physical scars. I asked him about it. I said, "You know what this is?" He did not look at me. He said, "My father was a hunter like you, like all of us. He came to this region when he was young, full of confidence and weapons and modern knowledge. He came back different. He came back alone. He never told me what happened, but he told me that some predators are not made for killing by conventional means. Some predators exist at the intersection of the natural and the unnatural. Toward dawn, the attacks ceased. The thing withdrew. We could see it in the distance, a dark shape against the pale tundra, simply waiting. Waiting for what? We did not immediately understand. Matthew turned away from the window and spoke directly to Lauren. He said, "It is waiting for him. Daniel's father is coming." We did not understand Matthew's statement at first. The logical part of our minds rejected it as impossible. But then Daniel's expression changed. He said, "Tell me he is not still alive." Lauren said, "Your father made a bargain when this creature let him live." She said the terms of that bargain meant periodic payment. She said every summer, a hunter would be drawn to this region through circumstances that seemed like coincidence. She said, "Your father guides them here." Daniel said nothing. He simply set down his rifle and walked out the door. We tried to stop him, but he moved with a single-mindedness that was unstoppable. He opened the door and walked out into the false dawn, and the creature that had been circling at the perimeter approached him. They met on the tundra like two old acquaintances, and I remember Daniel's shoulders dropping, a gesture of resigned recognition. But Daniel did not die. The creature did not devour him. Instead, they walked together toward the ridge where the structure stood, and as we watched from the lodge window, I understood. Daniel had made a choice. He had renewed the bargain. He would become the guide, drawing others here to fulfill the obligation. What happened after that moved with terrible speed and impossible clarity. The creature that had been pursuing us, the one that had been shaped by hunger and rage and ancient territorial claims, simply vanished. The immediate threat ceased. The pressure that had been mounting around us released like an abscess draining poison. Whatever the terms of the bargain were, they satisfied the thing enough that it withdrew its assault. Richard was alive, though badly damaged. When we ventured out to retrieve him, we found him conscious but broken, multiple bones shattered, internal injuries that would require professional treatment. He was lucid enough to understand that something had happened. He asked where Christopher was. Nobody answered because we all knew where Christopher was. We spent the remainder of the morning preparing the lodge for evacuation. Lauren placed more of her protective objects at the boundary, not to protect us anymore, but perhaps to contain something. Nicole documented everything in meticulous detail. She filled notebooks with observations, theories, analyses. She was trying to impose academic understanding on something that defied conventional knowledge. A helicopter arrived in the afternoon. A medical emergency had been declared for Richard, and the extraction was covered by wilderness protocols. When the paramedics saw Richard's injuries, I heard them discussing life flight to Fairbanks. But Richard insisted on being conscious as we prepared to leave. He grabbed my arm and said, Tell them what happened here." I said I would. He said, "No, tell them the truth. Tell them about the hunting season that has no end. Tell them about the things that live in the remote places and the bargains that hunters make when they are desperate for survival." I said I would. The helicopter lifted away, carrying Richard toward medical care. Matthew, Nicole, Lauren, and I remained at the lodge. We had a decision to make. We could stay and wait for transportation to be arranged. We could attempt to leave on our own. We could attempt to go back to the structures on the ridge and attempt some kind of final confrontation. Lauren said we should leave immediately. She said staying another night in this place invited the continuation of the cycle. She said we had been marked by what lived here, and any contact that extended beyond our current timeline would result in greater complications. We packed our essential supplies and began walking toward KOTZEBUE, 40 miles over tundra, in conditions that ranged from manageable to dangerous, but under the protection of Lauren's ritual work and the grace that comes from knowing you have survived something that should have killed you. It took us 18 hours to reach KOTZEBUE. We arrived at a clinic, reported what had happened, but the official story was very different from what actually occurred. Richard had been attacked by a bear. Christopher had died in the attack, bravely fighting to protect the others. Rachel had been killed in the same incident, her body not recovered. Daniel had ventured out to track the bear and had not returned. The official investigation found nothing that contradicted this narrative. There was an empty lodge. There was blood evidence that could be interpreted as consistent with animal attack. There were no bodies to contradict the story. There was no physical evidence of creatures that defied conventional biology. Except for one thing: Nicole's notebooks, her documentation, her academic analysis of what had occurred, written with meticulous precision and the voice of someone trained to observe and interpret. She intended to publish it as a comprehensive study of folklore, mental health crisis in extreme isolation, and the power of suggestion to reshape perception. But she never did. 8 months later, Nicole was involved in an accident, a car crash that seemed at first to be simple misfortune. But the investigation revealed something curious. Her car had driven off a cliff on a clear day, with no mechanical failure, no evidence of impairment. The official cause was ruled as driver error, but Nicole's notes were found in the wreckage, deliberately shredded. Someone did not want the story told. I kept my silence for nearly a year. I returned to my normal life. I tried to process what I had experienced in the language and framework of conventional psychology and trauma recovery. I tried to believe it had been hallucination or group hysteria or some other explanation that preserved my understanding of the world as rational and knowable. But then came the emails, dozens of them, from hunters I did not know, describing expeditions into remote regions that had gone wrong, describing creatures that moved in ways that defied physics, describing territorial predators that seemed to exist at the intersection of natural and supernatural, describing survival followed by mysterious circumstances that prevented them from telling their stories. The emails came from all over Alaska, from Canada, from Montana, from Colorado, from every wilderness region where men hunted without the infrastructure of civilization to protect them. And I realized what Lauren had known all along. I realized what Nicole had been trying to document before she was silenced. I realized what Daniel had accepted when he walked out to meet the thing that had destroyed his friends. The hunting season never ends. The predators in the remote places maintain their territory through bargains made with desperate men. Each hunter who ventures into certain lands becomes part of a cycle, a transaction that spans generations. Some are killed, some survive, marked forever by what they have witnessed, and some, like Daniel, become the mechanism by which the cycle continues, drawing new hunters to the slaughter because it is the only way they know to keep themselves alive. This is the story I promised to tell. I am telling it to you now, through an intermediary, through words that will be spoken by an artificial voice and carried across the internet to people who will hear it and attempt to decide whether it is truth or fiction, reality or entertainment. I am telling it because I have spent years watching hunters disappear into remote territories, and I have watched their families receive inadequate explanations. I am telling it because Lauren contacted me 3 years after our escape and said that Nicole was dead, that her death had not been accidental, and that the intelligences controlling this cycle were ensuring that documentation remained impossible. Most of all, I am telling it because if you listen to this story, and you recognize yourself in any part of it, if you have felt the call to hunt in the deep places where civilization does not reach, if you have felt the pull toward territories that seem to offer something beyond the material world, you need to understand what you are actually hunting. You are hunting something that hunts you. The summer season is approaching. The ice is breaking. The territories are opening. And somewhere on a ridge above KOTZEBUE, in structures built from bone and stone, something is waiting. Something that has already planned its hunts. Something that has already chosen its prey. Daniel walks those territories now, aging but functional, drawing hunters to their fates. He will do this until he dies, or until the cycle finds another mechanism. His bargain will not release him. None of the bargains ever do. This is what happened to us. This is what continues to happen. And if the stories from other hunters are accurate, if the emails I receive with increasing frequency are honest, it is happening with greater frequency and less restraint. The hunting season has no end. And we, the hunters, have become the hunted in ways we cannot escape and cannot adequately warn others about. Because the moment we begin to speak the truth, the cycle finds ways to silence us. This is my testimony. Hear it, remember it, and for the sake of your own survival, do not venture into the deep places believing you are the predator, because you are not. You have never been. There is a particular kind of quiet that arrives when the sun refuses to set, not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping world, but something unsettling. something that makes your nervous system question whether silence can actually have weight. I learned this truth 7 years ago, during what was supposed to be the most memorable hunting season of my life. Instead, it became the season I stopped hunting altogether. What I am about to share with you is not something I discuss casually. The events that unfolded above the Arctic Circle in Barrow, Alaska, have spent years buried beneath layers of rationalization and forgetting. But forgetting has become harder as time passes. The details have only sharpened. The fear has only deepened. My name is Anthony Lee. I was 37 years old when I received the phone call that changed everything. Heather Perez, a woman I had known for nearly 20 years through hunting circles and outdoor enthusiast communities, invited me on what she called the trip of a lifetime. She and I had crossed paths at various conventions and gatherings over the years. She was competent, professional, the kind of woman who planned logistics with military precision and never took unnecessary risks. Heather was organizing an expedition to the highest point in Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow. She wanted experienced hunters. She wanted people who understood extreme environments. She was assembling a small team, and my reputation had apparently reached her. The money was good. Better than good. The kind of money that makes a person stop asking the right questions. The expedition would last 14 days, early June, the season when Barrow exists in perpetual daylight. The hunting would be supplementary to the main objective, which was wildlife observation and photography for a private collector. This detail should have registered as odd. Why would a private collector hire hunters? What exactly were we hunting for? But I was excited. I had been stagnant in my regular life for years. The prospect of traveling to one of the most remote regions of North America, of working with serious professionals, of pushing myself against the frozen landscape, felt like permission to feel alive again. When I arrived in Barrow 3 days before the expedition was scheduled to begin, Heather met me at the small airport. She looked different than I remembered. Thinner. Her eyes held something I could not quite identify. Caution, maybe, or warning. The team was staying at a modest hotel on the edge of town. Heather introduced me to the others over breakfast the first morning. Mark Thompson was 65 years old, a retired hunting guide from the Colorado wilderness. He had deep lines in his face and hands that moved with practiced efficiency. He said very little, but when he did speak, people listened. Stephanie White was 40 years old and worked in wildlife management for the state of Alaska. She was knowledgeable in ways that made me realize how amateur many hunters actually were. She had that quality some people possess where they seem more comfortable with animals than with humans. Stephen Harris was 53 and owned outfitting companies across 3 states. He was loud in the way that people become loud when they are uncomfortable with silence. He told stories constantly, laughing at his own jokes before anyone else could. Kimberly Sanchez was 46 and worked as a logistics coordinator for a research organization in Anchorage. She handled the technical aspects of our expedition with quiet competence. She rarely made eye contact, but her equipment checks were obsessive, thorough, almost frightened in their precision. Andrew Clark was the youngest of us at 32. He was a wildlife photographer, which explained Heather's mention of a collector. He had worked in South Africa, in Nepal, in the Amazon basin. He had the confidence of a man who believed he had seen the most dangerous things the natural world could produce. We were 7 people in total, 7 people standing in a small meeting room in the northernmost American town, preparing to venture into the emptiness beyond. Heather laid out the itinerary with a map spread across a wooden table. We would travel by small chartered plane to a location approximately 90 kilometers northeast of Barrow, in a region of tundra that received minimal human visitation. We would establish a base camp there. From the camp, we would conduct daily expeditions, traveling by foot and terrain vehicles. The supposed objective was observing and documenting a particular species of Arctic predator. Heather was deliberately vague about which species. She said the collector preferred discretion. She said the less detail she provided, the less we would contaminate our observations with preconceived notions. I should have recognized this as strange. I should have asked which predator could possibly justify a 14-day expedition with hunting guides, a wildlife manager, and a wildlife photographer. But I did not ask. We none of us asked. We were already invested in the narrative we had constructed in our minds. That night, I could not sleep. The June light of Barrow never truly dimmed. At midnight, it appeared to be late afternoon. At 2 in the morning, it resembled early morning. Time became unmoored from the light. The sun hung in the sky like it was never going to leave, like it would remain suspended above the Arctic forever. I stood at the window of my hotel room and looked out at the town. Barrow is not a beautiful place. The landscape is flat and brutal, and honest in its rejection of human comfort. The buildings appear temporary, as if the earth beneath them might reject their presence at any moment. There are no trees. The absence of trees is somehow more noticeable than their presence might be elsewhere. As I stood at that window, I noticed something that I could not adequately explain to myself at the time. There were people out on the streets at midnight, which was not unusual for a place where the sun never truly set. But they were walking quickly. They were not making casual movements. They appeared to be heading to somewhere specific, with purpose and urgency. I counted them. 7 people walking in the direction of the northern edge of town, and then they were gone, simply vanished beyond the edge of my line of sight. I went to bed with this image in my mind. I dreamed of walking figures and perpetual light, and the sensation of being watched by something just beyond the boundaries of vision. The next morning, Heather distributed specialized gear, thermal layers, terrain boots rated for extreme conditions, weapons which we already possessed, but she insisted on checking each one personally. She inspected our ammunition with the intensity of someone checking for defects in armor before battle. When she reached my rifle, she held it for a moment longer than necessary. She looked at me directly. "What we are going to encounter out there," she said, "may not behave the way you expect. I need you to be prepared for possibilities that your training might not have prepared you for." "What possibilities?" I asked her. She did not answer. She simply moved on to the next person. That should have been my final opportunity to leave. That question that went unanswered should have been the moment I excused myself and booked a flight back home. But I did not leave. I remained. We all remained. The charter plane took us north out of Barrow. The landscape below transformed into something that barely qualified as landscape. It was flatness interrupted occasionally by the suggestion of relief, by the promise of variation that never quite materialized. Water pooled in places, creating patterns that appeared almost organized, almost intentional, as if something below the surface had arranged them deliberately. The pilot did not speak. The interior of the plane smelled of fuel and something metallic. Kimberly Sanchez sat across from me, and I watched her grip the armrest with tension that seemed disproportionate to the flight conditions. Her knuckles had gone white. Her jaw was clenched. In 12 years of flying to remote locations, she said to no one in particular, "I have learned that planes crash in places where rescue is impossible." No one responded to her comment, but I noticed that Mark Thompson nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had long suspected about the world. We landed at a small strip of cleared ground that could generously be called an airfield. The pilot cut the engines and looked back at us without turning his head, only his eyes moving in our direction. 14 days, he said. "I return in 14 days. Be ready." The door opened to a rush of cold air that seemed to carry weight. It pressed against my face and into my lungs. The sun was still high, still visible, still refusing to move toward the horizon. We were 90 kilometers from anything, from anyone, from the last structures of human habitation. We were in a place where the darkness could not hide us, and that felt like an important vulnerability. Heather surveyed the landscape with the expression of someone confirming that a terrible truth was exactly as terrible as she had remembered. She turned to us. "Camp is a 4-hour walk north," she said. "We move now." The tundra of northern Alaska is not wilderness in the way that other places are wilderness. The Amazon is wild because it is overgrown. It is wild because life has become so abundant that civilization cannot impose order upon it. The tundra is wild in the opposite way. It is wild because it is empty, because life has abandoned it, or was never truly welcome there, or exists in forms that we do not recognize as life at all. We walked for hours. The sun never changed position. It hung at the same angle, throwing shadows that never lengthened, creating a temporal landscape that was somehow worse than complete darkness. In complete darkness, you accept disorientation. In perpetual daylight, disorientation creates a specific kind of psychological pressure. The ground beneath our feet was uneven, moss-covered rocks that had been exposed to the elements for thousands of years. Water ran beneath the surface, creating soft spots that could swallow your foot past the ankle. We moved in a line, Heather leading, Mark Thompson second, Stephanie White third, Stephen Harris fourth, Kimberly Sanchez fifth, Andrew Clark sixth, and myself following at the end. I noticed something unusual about our formation, though I did not consciously acknowledge it until later. No one spoke. There was no casual conversation, no jokes from Stephen Harris, no technical observations from Stephanie White. There was only the sound of boots on ground and the persistent wind that moved across the landscape with the consistency of something alive. After 3 hours of walking, Mark Thompson held up his hand. We stopped. He pointed to something on the ground ahead of us. "Tracks," he said. We gathered around the marks in the moss and mud. They were large, 4-toed. The stride length suggested an animal of substantial size, but the shape was wrong. The proportions were off in a way that my brain could not quite process. "What animal makes a print like that?" Stephanie asked. "No animal that should be here," Mark said. He looked at Heather, and I saw something pass between them. Understanding, confirmation of something previously discussed. "How old?" Stephanie pressed. "Fresh," Kimberly said. "Within hours." Stephen Harris was silent. For once, the man who filled every silence with words had nothing to say. He stared at the tracks with the expression of someone watching the foundation of their understanding of the world crack and crumble. Andrew Clark raised his camera. He began photographing the tracks from multiple angles, his movements mechanical, as if his training had engaged, despite his mind's apparent rejection of what he was seeing. "We continue," Heather said. We resumed walking, but something had changed in the group dynamic. There was tension now. There was the unspoken acknowledgement that we had entered territory where the rules we understood no longer applied. Camp was established in a depression in the tundra that provided marginal shelter from the wind. Heather had brought prefabricated tents and equipment that allowed us to set up a functional base with efficiency. We worked without conversation, each person moving to their assigned task as if we had rehearsed this exact scenario multiple times. As the hours passed, the sun continued to hang in the sky. It did not set. It did not even move significantly. The light remained constant, creating a temporal nightmare where my body could not determine if it was time to sleep, time to eat, or time to remain vigilant. Heather gathered us around a camp stove where she was heating something that might have been food. "I need to be honest with you," she said. "Not completely honest, because I do not have all the answers, but more honest than I have been." She poured hot liquid into cups and distributed them. The drink was bitter and tasted like herbs I could not identify. "The collector who hired us," she continued, "has been investigating phenomena in this region for 7 years. Sightings, disappearances, interactions with something that does not match any known animal classification." "Phenomena," Mark Thompson said. "You mean the legends?" Heather nodded. "The local people have stories that go back centuries, stories about things that live on the tundra, things that wear the shapes of animals, things that are not animals at all, despite how they appear." Stephen Harris laughed. It was a sound like breaking glass. "You are talking about skinwalkers," he said. "You brought us out here to hunt Navajo mythology." "Not Navajo," Stephanie said quietly. "The traditions vary by region. The Inupiat, the Yupik, the Tlingit. They all have versions of the same fundamental understanding. Entities that exist between forms, that can assume animal shapes but are fundamentally something other." I stood up. I had heard enough. This conversation had moved beyond the boundaries of reason. "I am leaving," I said. "When the plane returns." "You cannot leave," Andrew Clark said. "Not before the 14 days are completed. Look at the contract you signed." I had signed a contract. Of course I had. But I had not read the specifics carefully. I had been too excited, too interested in the opportunity, too eager to accept the narrative that Heather had presented. "It requires all 7 team members to remain for the full 14 days, Andrew continued, his voice taking on a quality of genuine sympathy. "If any member leaves early, all compensation is forfeited, and there is a penalty clause." I looked at the contract that Kimberly produced from her equipment bag. The language was obscure and legal, but the intent was clear. We were bound here. For better or worse, we were going to remain. "The legends are not metaphor," Heather said as I sat back down. "The collector believes they are real, and based on what has been observed in this region over the past 7 years, he is probably correct." "What does he want us to do?" Mark asked. "Document it," Heather said. "Observe it. Photograph it if possible. Interact with it if necessary. The collector believes that the more we understand about these entities, the more we can comprehend their nature. And if we need to defend ourselves," Stephanie asked, "then you use the weapons you brought. The ammunition is specially prepared. The collector consulted with individuals who have experience with these matters. What kind of experience? I asked. Tribal elders, shamans, individuals whose cultural traditions include protocols for interaction with entities like these. We spent the first night in our tents, not sleeping. I lay on my bedroll and listened to the wind outside and tried to construct a rational explanation for what we were doing. I could not. There was no rational explanation. We were 7 people from normal lives, lying in tents on the Arctic tundra, waiting for something that we did not understand to approach us. At some point, approximately 4 hours after we had retired to our tents, I heard something outside, a sound like an animal moving through the camp. I held my breath and listened. The sound moved between tents, pausing at each one as if conducting an inspection. When it reached my tent, I could hear breathing, not the breathing of a large animal, the breathing of something that approximated human respiration but was somehow wrong. There were too many inhalations per cycle. There was a whistling quality to the exhales. I reached for my rifle, which I had positioned beside my bedroll. By the time my hand found it, the sound had moved on. The presence outside had departed, leaving only wind and the absence of safety. In the morning, no one spoke of nighttime disturbances. We moved through the routine of breakfast and equipment checks as if it had been an ordinary night. But Stephanie was pale. Kimberly's hands were shaking slightly as she organized supplies. Stephen Harris kept looking toward the landscape, scanning it as if he expected something to emerge from the tundra and explain what had visited our camp. Mark Thompson and Heather seemed less surprised. They communicated with glances. They seemed to be adjusting to something they had anticipated. "We move north today," Heather announced. "There has been activity reported in a specific valley approximately 15 kilometers from here. We established temporary observation posts. We packed and began walking. The tundra stretched before us, empty and hostile, and somewhere beneath the endless daylight, something that wore animal shapes but was not animal moved across the same ground. It had been in our camp. It had breathed outside my tent. It was close. It would remain close. By the end of the second day of observation, we had found evidence that confirmed the worst of what Heather had suggested: animal remains. Not the remains of animals killed by other animals. The remains of animals that had been systematically dismembered and arranged in patterns that could not be attributed to natural predation or scavenging. The patterns were deliberate. They suggested intelligence. They suggested something attempting to communicate through the language of death. By the 5th day in the field, the psychological pressure had begun to fragment our group. Stephen Harris drank heavily from the alcohol Heather had provided, claiming it was for medicinal purposes. His jokes had ceased entirely. He had become something hollow, something that moved through the motions of living but had lost the essence of whatever made him functional. Stephanie White spent hours reviewing the photographs that Andrew Clark had taken. She cataloged the evidence with obsessive precision, as if the act of documentation could somehow render the impossible into something manageable. Her hands developed a tremor. She wore gloves constantly to hide it. Kimberly Sanchez stopped sleeping. She sat outside the tents during the endless daylight hours, a rifle across her lap, watching the horizon. Mark Thompson eventually took watch with her in shifts. They did not speak. They simply maintained vigilance. Andrew Clark continued photographing, but the photographs had changed in character. They were no longer clinical documentation. They had become almost desperate. As if he believed that if he captured the entity on film from enough angles, from enough perspectives, he could somehow prove that it existed in a way that would make it less real. Heather moved through all of this with the demeanor of a woman attending to necessary business. She collected water samples. She took measurements. She recorded observations in a leather journal that she kept with her constantly. And I had begun to understand, with the kind of clarity that comes only when your mind finally accepts the rejection of everything it has been trained to believe, that we were not there to hunt the entity. We were there to be hunted by it. The proof of this understanding arrived on the 5th night. We had established a secondary camp approximately 8 kilometers from the primary site. The idea was to monitor different areas, to increase the probability of encountering the entity under controlled conditions. 5 of us were at the secondary camp. Mark Thompson and Heather remained at primary camp. The night began normally. We prepared food that tasted like ash in our mouths. We attempted conversation that died away after a few exchanges. We checked our weapons obsessively, chambering rounds and unchambering them, The repetitive action, something we could control when nothing else in the world remained controllable. Stephanie suggested that we maintain a watch rotation. No one disagreed. I volunteered to take the first watch. I positioned myself outside the tents with a rifle and the illusion of safety. The tundra at midnight in June is a specific kind of surreal. The sun had finally dipped lower in the sky, creating long shadows, but it did not set. It created a landscape of perpetual twilight. The shadows were purple and blue. The light had a quality of exhaustion. I sat on a rock formation and tried not to think about what had been in our camp on the first night. I tried not to think about the possibility that it might return. I tried not to think about the exact proportions of the tracks we had discovered, the way they had suggested something that was not quite animal, not quite anything else. At approximately 2 a.m, I heard Kimberly scream. I moved toward the tents faster than I would have thought my body capable of moving. Stephen Harris was already emerging from his tent, his rifle raised. Andrew Clark appeared behind him. "What happened?" I demanded. "Something was outside my tent," Kimberly said. I could see its shape against the fabric. It was large. It had too many limbs. "Too many limbs," Stephen Harris repeated, his voice unsteady. "What the hell does that mean, too many limbs?" "I do not know what I saw," Kimberly said, "but it was not right. Nothing about it was right." We checked the perimeter around the camp. The ground was soft enough to take impressions. We should have found tracks. There were no tracks. There were no signs of anything having approached the tents, except for the profound certainty in Kimberly's voice, in the color of her face, in the way her hands continued to shake. We consolidated our tents. All 5 of us remained in one tent for the remainder of the night, taking watch shifts, maintaining weapons, speaking in whispers because speaking loudly felt dangerous. The daylight never came. It remained twilight. Time had stopped progressing. In the morning, we communicated with Heather by radio. She instructed us to proceed as planned. We were to move to a specific location 15 kilometers to the east, where the collector believed activity would be concentrated. She and Mark Thompson would establish observation posts. We would conduct a systematic survey. I wanted to leave. I wanted to pack equipment and walk back to the airstrip and wait for the plane to return. But I had signed the contract. I was bound here. We were all bound here. The walk to the eastern location was the worst 4 hours of my life. The landscape began to change. The tundra vegetation became sparse. There were areas where the ground was completely bare, exposing dark soil that looked almost purple in the strange light. And in some of these bare areas, there were marks, scratches, as if something large with claws had been repeatedly dragging its appendages across the earth. When we arrived at the location Heather had specified, we found evidence of human habitation, old structures, weathered buildings that must have been constructed decades ago, a research station, perhaps, or a hunting camp. Andrew Clark wandered among the structures, photographing. He entered one of the more intact buildings and disappeared inside. When he emerged minutes later, he looked as if he had encountered something that had fundamentally altered his perception of reality. "There are journals in there," he said. "Multiple journals, written in different hands, different time periods, all describing the same thing." We found the journals. There were 8 of them, stacked on a metal table inside the building. The pages were yellowed. The ink had faded but remained legible. The earliest journal was dated 1981. The handwriting was precise, almost architectural in its precision. Day 4 of observation. The entity remains elusive. Visual confirmation has proven impossible. However, we have located additional evidence of its presence. The patterns of the animal remains suggest an intelligence that is attempting communication. We do not understand the language of its communication, but the intent is clear. Something in this region is aware of us. Something in this region is watching us. Each subsequent journal followed a similar trajectory: increased observation, accumulated evidence, escalating interactions, and in the final journal, dated 2012, the entries had become increasingly frantic. We understand now. Understanding is worse than ignorance. When we did not understand, we could maintain hope that there might be rational explanation. Now we know. Now we have accepted. And acceptance has made us vulnerable. The entity has sensed our understanding. It has begun closing the distance. It will arrive soon. It will arrive in the night. It will arrive in the daylight. It will arrive, and we will not be able to hide from it, because it understands us far better than we understand ourselves. That was the final entry. There was no subsequent journal. We did not know what had happened to the author. We needed to leave. The decision was unanimous and immediate. We assembled the few things we had brought with us and began walking back toward primary camp. But Heather had instructed us to remain in the eastern location until evening. She had been explicit about this. Stephen Harris refused to wait. He announced that he was walking back to primary camp immediately, contract or no contract. Andrew Clark chose to accompany him. Kimberly, Stephanie, and I remained, not out of obedience, but out of a paralyzing uncertainty about what course of action would be less dangerous. We waited. Hours passed. The sun moved marginally. The shadows shifted, and as evening approached, something changed in the air. There was a pressure, a weight, as if the atmosphere itself had become less amenable to human habitation. Stephanie pointed toward the landscape to the north. There was a shape moving across the tundra. It was too far away to identify clearly, but it was large, and it was moving with a gait that was neither quite animal nor quite human. It moved on what might have been legs, though the number of legs seemed to vary depending on the angle and the light. "It is coming," Kimberly whispered. "We do not have weapons that can stop it," Stephanie said. "We do not have training that covers this. We do not have any preparation that is adequate for what is approaching." We ran. There is no other way to describe it. We abandoned the location and ran across the tundra, moving in the direction of primary camp. Behind us, I could hear it. The entity, the skinwalker, whatever we wanted to call the thing that the land had produced or harbored or attracted. It was not moving at full speed. I understood in that moment, with perfect and horrifying clarity, that it was not running at its maximum capability. It was pacing us. It was playing. It was curious about how fast we could move, how far we could run, how long we could maintain the fiction that we might escape. Stephanie fell first. She went down hard and did not get up. Kimberly turned to retrieve her, and I grabbed her arm. "We cannot," I said. She turned to look at me, and I saw the moment her mind accepted this horrible truth. She ran. We both ran, leaving Stephanie behind. I do not know what happened to her. I know that we heard sounds from behind us for approximately 200 meters after we left her position. Sounds that suggested something being comprehended in ways that sound understood and conveyed. Then there were no sounds except our own breathing and our own footfalls. We reached primary camp as the perpetual daylight began to shift toward a deeper purple at the horizon. Heather and Mark Thompson were waiting for us. They did not seem surprised by our condition. They did not ask questions. "Where are the others?" Heather asked. "Stephen Harris and Andrew Clark headed back this direction hours ago." Kimberly gasped between breaths. Stephanie stayed behind. The entity came. We ran. Heather nodded slowly. "The collector anticipated this possibility," she said. "We are not here to capture the entity. We cannot. The entity is something that exists outside the parameters of what we consider possible. We are here to test the boundaries of its awareness, to determine its capabilities, to understand its limitations by observing how it interacts with human prey." "You used us as bait," I said, deliberately. Heather turned to look at me with something that might have been sympathy, or might have been the closest approximation that a woman like her could manage. "We have been out of contact with Stephen Harris and Andrew Clark since 3 hours ago," she said. "They were supposed to head back here. They never arrived." The primary camp was larger than I had realized. Beyond the tents that the 7 of us had pitched were additional structures. Larger tents, equipment that suggested long-term habitation, metal boxes with serial numbers and markings that suggested government or military origin. Heather showed us to one of the larger tents. Inside there was a functioning observation room. Maps covered the walls. Photographs were pinned to corkboards. Some of the photographs dated back decades. They showed the same landscape in different seasons, different lighting conditions, and in many of them there were shapes, blurs, suggestions of something in the periphery. Mark Thompson explained what we were looking at. "The collector has been monitoring this region for 7 years," he said, "but there have been observers here much longer. The journals you found came from the 1980s research station, but there were observers before that. Researchers who came in the 1960s, military personnel in the 1950s. "How long," I asked, "has this thing been here?" "There are records from indigenous peoples dating back to the pre-contact period, oral histories, stories passed down through generations. The entity or entities like it have existed in this region for longer than recorded human history." "Why have we not heard of this?" Kimberly asked. "Why is this not known?" "Because the entity has the capacity to erase what it does not wish to be known," Heather said. The collectors who disappeared? There is no record of them anywhere, no missing person reports, no investigation, no acknowledgement by families or institutions that they were ever here. The entity does not simply kill, it erases. I thought of Stephanie. I thought of Stephen Harris and Andrew Clark. I thought of the journals and the frantic final entries. I thought of all the people across decades and centuries who had come to this place and had encountered the thing that wore animal shapes and had never been heard from again. What does it want? Kimberly asked. Why does it take people? We do not know, Heather said. The collector believes it wants to be understood, to have its existence witnessed, to have its nature documented. There is an intelligence behind what it does. There is intentionality. A noise from outside interrupted the conversation. It sounded like an animal in distress, the sound of something experiencing pain. That is Andrew Clark, Mark Thompson said matter-of-factly. I moved toward the tent opening, but Heather blocked my path with the kind of physical authority that suggested she had done this before and would not be moved. He is no longer human, Heather said. What remains is a performance of his shape. What controls the movement is the entity. The entity is testing us by using him as an intermediary. The sound continued. It was Andrew Clark's voice, but the words coming from his mouth were not words that any human throat had ever been designed to produce. They were sounds, complex, layered sounds that suggested multiple things vocalizing simultaneously. We need to shoot him, Kimberly said. We need to end whatever is happening. You can try, Mark Thompson said, his voice devoid of emotion. But the entity has already proven that conventional weapons inflict only minimal damage. You would simply cause suffering without stopping what is occurring. The sounds from outside changed pitch. They began to approximate language, broken language, language that had been learned by studying human speech, but never quite mastered. Leave, the thing that had been Andrew Clark said. Leave, 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 remaining, remaining, remaining. Danger, danger, danger. It was a warning. I understood that immediately. The entity was using Andrew Clark to communicate something to us. It was giving us information. We cannot leave, Heather said to the tent canvas, as if speaking to the entity itself. The contract does not permit early departure. The sound that responded was not language. It was laughter, a sound like wind moving through bone structures, like the grinding of frozen ground shifting, like animals dying slowly across a landscape. Then the presence outside moved away. The sounds diminished. The pressure in the air seemed to lift slightly, though not completely. Something was still present. Something was still watching. In the silence that followed, Heather explained the complete truth of our situation. There are additional team members, she said, outside the 7 of you. We have logistics staff, security personnel, research coordinators. They remain at a camp approximately 40 kilometers south. They know nothing of what occurs here. They will retrieve us in 7 days for the scheduled resupply flight. You lied to us, I said. I withheld information, Heather corrected, but not for the purposes of deception, for purposes of psychological stability. The fewer people who understand what is occurring, the smaller the footprint we make on the entity's awareness. The entity seems to fixate on populations of consciousness. The more of us it perceives, the more aggressive its behavior becomes. What does it want from us? Kimberly asked again. Heather looked at Mark Thompson, and they seemed to have some unspoken discussion. Mark Thompson moved to one of the metal boxes and withdrew a notebook bound in leather. The collector has been accumulating data for 7 years, Mark said. He has hired 17 research teams. Each team has been composed of 5 to 10 individuals with relevant survival skills or academic expertise. Of those teams, only partial teams have ever emerged from the field. How many deaths? Kimberly asked. 73, Mark said. Confirmed and inferred. The actual number is likely higher. And the collector continues to send teams, I said. The collector is a man obsessed with understanding, Heather said. He believes that eventually, through accumulation of data, through precise observation, we will achieve comprehension of the entity's nature. That comprehension will provide leverage. Leverage to negotiate. Leverage to establish boundaries. There is no negotiating with this thing, Kimberly said. This thing erases people. Perhaps that is simply the method of communication we have not yet learned to interpret, Heather said. That is madness, I told her. Madness and progress are often confused, Heather replied. As the false night deepened into a state that was almost twilight, I realized something that had been evolving slowly throughout the entire expedition. Heather and Mark Thompson were not actually concerned about survival. They were recording data. They were observing. They were documenting, in a way that was different but not entirely distinct from what the entity itself seemed to be doing. Mark Thompson spent the next several hours moving between two large tents, where he operated sophisticated monitoring equipment. He showed me some of the footage, thermal imaging, audio recordings, spectroscopic data that I did not understand. The equipment was capturing something, a presence, a pattern of activity that occurred in specific locations and at specific intervals. The entity is territorial, Mark said, pointing at a map with overlaid heat signatures. It maintains patrol routes. It appears to have preference for certain locations and times. This suggests behavior that is almost rational, almost understandable. Why use Andrew Clark to speak to us? Kimberly asked. Because the entity is learning, Heather said. It has learned human language through generations of observation, through the studies of the people it has consumed or incorporated. The entity might be something that absorbs the consciousness of those it takes. It might be developing a kind of cumulative intelligence by adding the knowledge and language capability of each human that it acquires. If that is true, Mark said, then it is improving. Every encounter teaches it more. Every person it takes adds to its understanding of human behavior. Eventually, it might become sophisticated enough to infiltrate human populations, to move among humans without detection. That is a theory without evidence, I said. That is precisely why we are here, Heather told me, to gather evidence, to move us closer to understanding whether such integration is possible. As the perpetual daylight began to shift toward actual darkness in the deep purple of the Arctic night cycle, I felt something breaking inside me. Not my mind, exactly, but my capacity to believe in the continuity of the world as I had understood it. The entity was not a creature that my training could address. It was something that violated the basic categories by which I attempted to organize reality. Kimberly seemed to be experiencing something similar. She sat in the corner of the observation tent and did not move. She did not speak. She simply existed in a state of compressed trauma. On the 7th day, we received notification that the resupply flight would arrive as scheduled in 4 days. Heather seemed relieved by this information. She transmitted coordinates and supply lists to the logistics team. She made arrangements for the collection of data and equipment. The collector will be pleased with our progress, she said. The recordings and observations from this expedition represent the most comprehensive data set we have ever compiled. The entity has been unusually active, unusually visible. This suggests that it is becoming more comfortable with human presence, or it is becoming less cautious about concealment. Either possibility is concerning, Mark said. Either possibility is fascinating, Heather corrected. I began to understand, in the days leading up to the resupply flight, that whatever happened when that plane landed would not be an escape. I would not simply return to my normal life and place this experience behind me. Something fundamental had changed. The world contained things that should not exist, and now that I had knowledge of their existence, I was infected with that knowledge. I would carry it forever. Late on the 7th night, as the darkness reached its absolute limit before beginning to lighten again, I heard movement outside the observation tent. Not the movement of the entity this time, something different, something almost human but not quite. When I looked outside, I saw figures moving across the tundra, 7 of them, moving in a line from the direction of the western landscape. They moved like people. They had the shape of people, but there was something wrong about their movements. Something that suggested the entity had learned to mimic human locomotion, but had not yet perfected the imitation. They were walking toward the camp. I woke Heather and Mark Thompson. I did not wait for their response. I grabbed Kimberly and we moved to the emergency pack that had been maintained since our arrival. Kimberly did not resist. She seemed to have been waiting for the moment when escape would become not just possible, but necessary. We ran, into the tundra, away from camp, away from the observation equipment and the records and the madness of people who would sacrifice others for the pursuit of understanding. Behind us, I heard Heather speaking to the figures, speaking as if she had been expecting this, as if she had anticipated that the entity would eventually cease being mere subject and would begin to be active participant. Running across Arctic tundra in the depths of what passes for night in the summer months is an experience that has the quality of nightmare. The ground is treacherous, the landscape is featureless in the darkness. The only marker of progress is the increasing exhaustion of your body and the knowledge that something is pursuing you that understands this landscape better than you ever could. Kimberly and I maintained contact through force of will alone. We did not speak. Speech would have consumed energy that we could not spare. We simply ran in the direction that we believed led south, toward the logistics camp, toward human habitation of a kind that was not designed for the purposes of scientific observation. Hours passed. The Arctic night transitioned toward the false dawn that marks the approach of true daylight in the polar regions. The landscape slowly became visible. We could see better, we could run faster, and we could confirm what we had both suspected. Nothing was pursuing us. The entity had not followed. The movement we had made toward escape had not triggered chase. Kimberly understood this at the same moment I did. She slowed her pace. Then she stopped completely. "It let us go," she said. "It wanted us to leave," I said. "It wanted us to carry the knowledge, to tell the story, to spread the understanding. Each person who knows of the entity's existence becomes a vector for that knowledge. Knowledge becomes memory. Memory becomes storytelling. Storytelling becomes belief. Belief becomes attention. And attention is what the entity craves." We continued moving south, more slowly now, with the horrible certainty that escape was never part of the equation. The entity had used us as seeds. We would carry the information of its existence back into the world. We would tell people, and those people would tell others, and gradually, slowly, across decades perhaps, the knowledge would spread. The logistics camp was exactly where the maps indicated it should be, exactly where Heather's careful planning had positioned it. Personnel in white uniforms emerged to greet us. They helped us inside. They provided blankets and hot food. They did not ask many questions. Kimberly and I were the only two who emerged from the expedition. No one asked about the others. The logistics staff seemed to have been operating under the assumption that casualty was likely. "You will need to provide a report," the camp supervisor told me, "a detailed accounting of everything that occurred." I understood that providing a report meant I would be documented. My knowledge would be added to the collector's accumulating database. I would become, in a sense, part of the infrastructure of observation, part of the system of understanding that the entity had constructed. But I provided the report anyway. I described everything. The entity, the SKINWALKER, the way it had appeared in different forms and variations, the way it had used Andrew Clark as an intermediary, the way Heather and Mark Thompson seemed to be working toward purposes beyond simple scientific documentation. The supervisor recorded everything. He thanked me. He assured me that I would be transported back to BARROW as soon as possible, and from there to the continental United States. The return flight to BARROW was scheduled for the following day. I did not sleep that night. I sat in a small room in the logistics camp and tried to construct a narrative that would allow me to return to normal life. I could not construct such a narrative. There was no normal life to return to. The world had revealed itself to contain things that should not exist, and my knowledge of those things would reshape how I moved through existence forever. On the flight back to BARROW, the pilot did not speak to me. He seemed to know something of what I had experienced. Or perhaps he simply saw, in the state of my appearance and demeanor, confirmation of a truth he had already accepted. Back in BARROW, I stayed in the same hotel room. I tried to rest. I tried to eat. I tried to maintain the basic functions of survival. On the second night, I received a phone call in my room. It was Kimberly. "I need to see you," she said. "There is something you need to understand." We met at a small diner on the edge of town. Kimberly looked as if she had aged years in the space of days. Her face was drawn. Her eyes held a quality of resignation. "I have been investigating," she said, looking into the collector, looking into the organization behind the research. "What did you find?" I asked. "The collector does not exist," she said. "There is no private individual commissioning research. There is an organization, a government organization. They have been monitoring the entity since 1952. They have been conducting research continuously for over 70 years. "How many people?" I asked. "Hundreds," she said, "perhaps more. The early records are incomplete, but the scale of the research is immense, and there is no indication that it will ever cease. They will continue to send teams. They will continue to gather data. They will continue to work toward understanding or control or adaptation. The entity will continue to evolve," I said. "Yes," Kimberly confirmed. "Every person it takes adds to its intelligence. Every year it learns more about human behavior. Eventually, There will be sufficient integration, sufficient learning, and then it will not need us to carry knowledge anymore. It will be ready to move into human spaces, to integrate into human populations, to exist among us without detection. When, I asked. I do not know, she said, but there have been sightings in Anchorage, in Fairbanks, in places where there is human population. The movement has begun. We sat in silence. The perpetual daylight of Arctic summer filtered through the windows. Somewhere in that landscape, in the spaces between human habitation, something was learning, something was growing, something was preparing. I flew back to the continental United States the next day. I resigned from my positions. I sold my property. I have spent the years since in a state of quiet preparation. Not preparation for escape, because there is nowhere to escape to. Preparation for coexistence, for learning to live in a world that contains things we were not meant to encounter. Kimberly has contacted me occasionally. She has sent me documents, articles about disappearances in northern regions, photographs of things that should not exist, reports from indigenous peoples about changes in the behavior of entities that had remained in balance with human habitation for generations. The balance is breaking, the entity is learning, it is growing, and it is moving. This is what I have come to understand in the years since the expedition. The entity does not kill for sustenance. It does not kill for dominance. It kills for knowledge. And it will continue to kill, continue to absorb, continue to grow, until it has sufficient understanding to transition from the role of observed anomaly to the role of active participant in human civilization. And perhaps that is the intention. Perhaps that is what the collector, or the government organization, or whatever force guides the research has always been working toward. Integration, not the elimination of the entity, but the accommodation of the entity into human systems. That thought keeps me awake at night. That thought, and the memory of how we ran across the tundra, and how the entity allowed us to escape, and how the escape was never escape at all. It was transmission, dispersal of knowledge, distribution of the seed. I am 79 words into closing this narrative, and I want to leave you with one final understanding. The entity is still out there. The entity is still learning. The entity is still approaching. And if you are reading this, if you are listening to this story in the darkness, then the knowledge is now in you as well. You are carrying it now. You are a vector for transmission. The entity thanks you for your attention.